All right, today we are diving into one of the most incredible stories in all of music history. We're going to unpack how a pretty small group of composers over about 150 years literally built the musical DNA that we still use to this day. So yeah, let's get right into it. You know, the whole thing really starts with a kind of paradox. We're talking about a musical school that had no building, no campus, wasn't even based in a single country. And yet, this idea created a musical language that would go on to dominate an entire continent for centuries. So the big question is, how on earth did they pull that off? So from around 1430 to the end of the 1500s, these composers were, and I'm not exaggerating, the absolute superstars of their time. We're talking popes, emperors, dukes, everyone who was anyone wanted to hire them. Why? Because they had something nobody else did, a new, powerful, and revolutionary way of writing music. But before we get into the music itself, we really have to get our bearings and figure out what this so-called school actually was, because it's not what you think. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The composers themselves, they all came from one small region, basically what we'd now call Belgium and northern France. But here's the twist. They didn't really work there. They were musical exports, headhunted by the wealthiest courts and cathedrals in Italy, Spain, and Germany. So what held them together? It wasn't a place. It was a shared set of rules, a musical craft that was passed down directly from teacher to student. So how did this whole school of thought even begin? Well, it all started with a single radical idea from the first generation, led by a composer named Guillaume Dufay. His big idea? He believed music could be just as grand, just as unified as a massive cathedral. I mean, you have to understand. Before Dufay, a typical church service was musically just a collection of short, totally unrelated pieces. The sound was often kind of sparse, almost thin. And then Dufay comes along and just changes the whole game. He figured out a way to connect all the different sections of the Mass into one single, massive, unified work of art. And the sound was warmer, richer, and more blended than anything people had heard before. So the big question is, how did he do it? With this absolutely brilliant innovation, the Cantus Firmus Mass. The idea itself is simple, but completely revolutionary. You take one melody, the Cantus Firmus, or firm song, and you weave it like a secret golden thread through all 5 movements of the Mass. And for the very first time, a 30-minute piece of music could feel like a single coherent journey from beginning to end. And this quote just nails it perfectly. This wasn't just some new trick, it was a completely new ambition for what music could be. It proved that music could have the same structural integrity, the same awe-inspiring scale as the giant stone cathedrals it was being performed in. Okay, so if the first generation built the foundation, the next generation took those structural ideas and pushed them to the absolute extreme of complexity. Welcome to the world of Johannes Ockeghem, the undisputed master of endless flowing sound. Seriously, if Dufay built the cathedral, Ockeghem filled it with this dense, swirling fog of sound. Listening to his music is like staring into a river. There are no obvious stopping points, no clear little phrases you can hum. Instead, you just get this continuous, mesmerizing web of melodies, often anchored by some of the lowest bass notes anyone had written up to that point. It's incredible. And Ockeghem's specialty was a technique that required almost superhuman skill, the canon. Think of it as the ultimate musical puzzle. You probably know the simplest version, right? Row, row, row your boat. Well, this is like that, but on an infinitely more complex and beautiful level. One voice starts, and the others have to follow it perfectly, note for note. So here's how it works. You've got the leader who starts the melody. Then, a few beats later, the follower comes in, copying the leader exactly. But here's the kicker, the part that's so mind-bending. It's not enough to just copy the tune. The combination of their lines has to create beautiful, correct harmony at every single moment. It's just a breathtaking feat of musical engineering. Okay, so after Ockenheim's wild complexity, you might be wondering, where do you go from there? Well, the next generation, led by the absolute legend Josquin des Prez, found a way to take everything that came before and synthesize it into a perfect, elegant balance. Josquin's great innovation was something called pervasive imitation, and the idea is wonderfully clear and elegant. For every new line of lyrics, the composer writes a new little melodic idea. That melody is then introduced by one singer, and then it's imitated by all the others, passed through the choir one by one. It's not as strict as a canon, but it creates this beautiful, cascading conversational texture. And the results of this? They were absolutely profound. All of a sudden, all the voices were equal, There was no lead singer hogging the spotlight. Music really became a conversation between equals. And for the listener, it created a new kind of clarity. You could actually follow the structure of the music just by hearing these new melodic ideas pop up. But maybe most importantly, it allowed the music to perfectly express the feeling and meaning of the words being sung. So now let's zoom out and just take a look at the massive legacy here. This incredible 150-year evolution saw a musical style get perfected, cementing its role as the foundational DNA for literally centuries of music that would follow. You can see the whole story of innovation so clearly on this timeline. It starts with Dufay, who creates the large-scale structure, then Ockeghem comes along and pushes the technical complexity to its absolute limits. Josquin finds that perfect synthesis of structure and clarity, and it all culminates in the late 1500s with two final masters who really represent the two sides of this amazing musical coin. So on one hand, you've got Orlando di Lasso, the cosmopolitan, the world traveler, the experimenter. This guy wrote over 2,000 pieces in every style you can imagine, from the most deeply sacred music to rowdy German drinking songs. His emotional range was just staggering. And then on the other hand, you have Palestrina, the Roman purist. He focused almost exclusively on creating a pure, perfect, and spiritually serene sacred music. His style was so refined, so consistent, that it literally became the official textbook model for how to write correct music for hundreds of years. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? What should you remember? Well, it's really three huge ideas that this school gave us. First, counterpoint, that art of weaving independent voices together, became the absolute foundation of music education for everybody. Second, they basically invented the idea of a large, unified musical work, a concept that leads directly to things like the symphony. And third, they created this democratic texture, this idea of music as a dialogue between equals, a principle that's behind everything from a string quartet to a modern jazz combo. Which brings us to this final thought, and it's a perfect summary of their whole philosophy. For these composers, technical skill wasn't just about showing off how clever you were. No, they understood something much deeper, that the highest level of craft was the only way to achieve the highest level of expression. For them, the two were inseparable. The craft was the expression.